Tom, I'm curious if you've noticed something I have as we've watched Joe Biden, whether it's through debates or town halls or press conferences or any time the media gets in front of him. He says the same thing every time. I don't know the answer, but I'm just going to listen to what the scientists say. I'm just going to listen to what the experts say. It's literally every single time. I have yet to hear the guy answer a single question, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about the coronavirus, whether it's about what he's going to wear tomorrow or when he's going to go speak or who he's going to go talk to. I'm going to wait for the experts.
He's a prototypical perfect progressive. I mean, that is the model of what it means to be a progressive. When you go back to the very beginnings of progressivism, you and I have mentioned this before, and I think it's still hard for some people to get their minds around this. The fact that progressivism, it's really old. It's not new. It didn't start with Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. It stretches all the way back to the 19th century, the 1870s, 1880s. And their dream, they had sort of this vague dream, was to have a regime of central planning, scientists, experts, bureaucrats who would study and amass all this knowledge and evidence, and then come up with policies and regulations, and they would decide how people should live and what, they would make all the important decisions. So in that sense, Joe Biden is actually demonstrating in his own actions what it means to be a progressive. Defer to the experts. For me, it almost raises a question: why have a president? Why have an elected president? Why have an elected Congress? The whole purpose of the Congress, they're supposed to deliberate. Why do you need a deliberative Congress and then an elected president with a veto power? Let's just have the bureaucrats at, I don't know, the State Department maybe. They should make all foreign policy decisions. And we'll have the scientists at the Centers for Disease Control, we'll have them make all health decisions, right? And we'll have the bureaucrats at the FDA decide what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat. The point is, we have loads and loads of bureaus of bureaucrats. I'm not quite sure from the progressive point of view why elected representatives are really important.
That almost seems to be the theme of all of our conversations about government lately, and not just you and me. I'm talking about the conversations that we're having with our chapter members, the conversations we're having with our friends. Last week, we asked the question, if we're going to have a progressive Supreme Court that's not committed to defending the Constitution,
why have a Supreme Court?
Why have a Supreme Court? So now we're at a point of, why have a Supreme Court? Why have a president? Why not just let the legislature make all the decisions? And really all they're doing is saying, we're going to go create all these bureaus and all these alphabet soup of organizations. And
well, it's interesting. An old colleague of mine, he's more than a colleague, I consider him one of my mentors. His name is John Marini. He's taught for many years at the University of Nevada at Reno. And John is one of the few people who he's really devoted his scholarly career to understanding progressivism, its origins, its intellectual origins, tracing those ideas back to thinkers like Hegel and other European continental thinkers. And one of the points that Marini emphasizes is how progressivism has transformed all three branches of the national government. They tend to not do what they were designed to do, what they're supposed to do, and instead they're busy doing things they're not doing. In the case of Congress, the whole design, when you look at the design of Congress, it's this very strange institutional arrangement. First of all, you have these two different chambers. They respond to very different constituents. Under the original Constitution, Senate was selected by state legislators. Representatives were popularly elected every 2 years. And so you look at that, the main activity that was supposed to go on in Congress was deliberation.
Right.
You have very different kinds of people representing different interests, all of whom are supposed to uphold and protect the Constitution. They take an oath to it. And they were supposed to deliberate on what exactly is the public good, what should public law be, what should we be passing, what should we not be passing. Instead, there's very little deliberation. You can see this For example, on C-SPAN, you see these jokers in Congress get up there and, they'll give a speech at 1 o'clock in the morning. There's nobody there.
Right.
They're just speaking to a handful of their donors who they promised to do something.
It's all for video.
It's all for show. There's no actual deliberation, because what Congress has become is mainly an oversight and funding mechanism for the progressive regulatory agencies. Sure. That's what they do.
Sure. It's interesting when you say Joe Biden is the perfect progressive, right? He's deferring to all of these people. At the same time, we've talked a lot about how progressivism has evolved over 150 years, right? Mm-hmm. It starts as this intellectual movement among academic elites who are going and starting programs at colleges and universities. It evolves into a political program. It evolves into a political movement under Wilson and then mostly under FDR.
Right.
And then it evolves into a cultural movement as we get into the 60s. And there was that point in the 60s, and we've talked a lot about how we started to, as a people, as an American people, we started to celebrate, almost romanticize these progressive politicians, these politicos, right, as these great figures, the same way that we did for Hollywood actors, right, sports stars, things like that. And this just came to my mind. So you and I haven't talked about this yet. I'm curious about your reaction.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going off script. This is very dangerous. Only trained professionals can do this.
So those things were happening about every 40, 50 years, right? You had about 50 years of intellectual movement, and then you had about 30, 40 years of a political movement, and then the cultural movement started.
Well, and I want to make clear, because I don't want people to think that it went from being one thing to the other.
Sure.
It basically expanded.
It just expanded.
Because in the 1930s and 40s, you still had the intellectual class of progressives in the universities. It expanded to include the political parties and politicians and changing the institutions of government. And then you jump ahead to the 1960s and 70s, and it adds to it this cultural dimension.
Right. So as Bernie Sanders has called Joe Biden, claiming he will be the most progressive president since FDR.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm almost noticing a progression, right? Joe Biden is now not just adopting policies of experts. He's adopting policies of other politicos who have been in government for 50 years alongside of him. Right. Bernie Sanders is now his consultant on climate change and in the environment.
Sure.
So he is now starting to look to people who have established themselves solely through government.
Right.
Bernie Sanders didn't go to any academic institution for the purpose of learning about environment.
You mean he's not a particle physicist from MIT?
I'm actually trying to think where Bernie Sanders, what his academic background even really is.
I don't remember.
I know he spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union learning.
Right.
You think about that. We have celebrated these people so much that they've started referencing each other.
Right.
It almost feels like we've closed this loop on insanity, right? We are
It's a new kind of political unified field theory, right? Where
right.
Everything is self-contained and references itself.
Well, we always talk about in politics, a lot of these things are, if you say them enough over enough time, you start to believe they're true and other people will also.
Yep.
I think Bernie Sanders has said this stuff enough over enough time that he certainly believes his own BS.
Right.
And now so many other people do that he's now qualifying as an expert under the progressive rule. And I'm sitting there thinking, how in the world can this actually be happening?
Yeah.
We have one person who's not an expert saying we need to rely on the experts.
Right.
And my expert is another guy who's not an expert, but he's convinced you he is over the last 50 years in government.
Right. Well, part of, we have talked about this in earlier discussions, part of progressivism is a new understanding of human nature that reason really is not. It is not the pathway to truth. It is not the pathway to understanding the objective world around us. That really what we have different cultural prejudices and perspectives, kind of a multicultural view of the world. And there is no truth. And therefore, what matters most often in politics is not one's knowledge of truth. It's not some assembly of facts. It's one's passion. It's one's interest. It's one's devotion or commitment. My old professor, Harry Newman, used to love to point out that word commitment, which we now use. We use it in terms of describing marriage right agreements, but it used to mean being committed to an insane asylum, right? It meant you were crazy. They would commit you to an institution. But this often, this now passes in the progressive world to be really passionate. It's why, we were talking about cultural progressivism. On the one hand, they will, these cultural icons will support and praise and give awards to progressive politicos. I mean, think of every Hollywood award show now. It's more about politics than it is about movies and TV shows and things like that. And there's a bunch of progressive celebrities up there railing against whatever non-progressive, politicians are their enemy of the day. But at the same time, progressive journalists will go to the progressive celebrities. They'll walk up to a Matt Damon and ask him these questions about education policy or global climate change policy or whatever it is, right? As if this is some kind of expert.
Right. I was just gonna ask you, who's a bigger expert on climate change, Bernie Sanders or Matt Damon?
Right.
I really want to know. And how did they develop that expertise?
Right.
I wonder how many of them you could actually turn to and say, okay, tell me the data.
Right.
Show me the data. Explain this to me. Did you just hear one day that this is a problem and now everybody cares about it?
Right.
And what's amazing is, I think back to old episodes of The Simpsons where they were making fun of this stuff. They were making fun of the people who just blindly said, oh yeah, climate change, global warming, this is...
One of my favorite episodes of The Simpsons, I never get to talk about this, so I'm glad you mentioned it. And this is long, this would have been, I don't know, the first 5 or 6 seasons. It's been on TV now for a long time.
32, 33 seasons.
So this is one of the great themes of classical political philosophy. You can find this theme in Plato, and there it is in The Simpsons. They raise the question, who should rule in the town of Springfield?
Right.
And they all agree.
I know exactly where you're going.
The smartest, right? Let's have the experts, the smartest. And so they all agree to that, and then they think, well, who are the smartest? How do we know who the smartest are? And someone proposes the local chapter of Mensa. Mensa is this old club where you have to you got to score a certain number on an IQ test, and then you get to belong to Mensa. So they go to Mensa, and Lisa Simpson's in there because she's really smart. The goofy scientist, the guy who runs the comic book store, he's kind of eccentric, but they're
the doctor, Dr. Hibbert.
Yeah, that's right.
They're all part of it.
And all I remember is at the end of the episode, they all get in a fight with each other about who the smartest among them is. Right. And the result is that Springfield is on fire and buildings are burning down. There's total chaos and destruction.
And remember what happened towards the beginning when they first started to put all of these ideas in place before they ever even got power. There was a fight between them or a disagreement between them and Homer and his buddies sitting at a gazebo in the park.
Yep.
And Homer and his buddies were not disturbing anybody. They were sitting around having a couple of beers, hanging out as friends, just talking. And these Mensa people went and got the police and said, "You've got it. We deserve to have that gazebo, not them.
Right.
We are the experts. We need a place to congregate."
Yep.
It is this intellectual elitism. It's this idea that I know better than you do. That my friends and those who agree with me because I'm more intelligent. Anybody who agrees with me is right.
I mean, we've been joking here, and yet these are first of all, they're deep philosophic questions, and they're serious political and cultural problems today. I mean, one of the and this comes from classical philosophy. In the case of Plato, it's actually his teacher Socrates. He's thinking this through, and he ends up with this rather ridiculous notion of a philosopher king, and it's ridiculous. That's not my judgment. That's Socrates himself makes fun of his own conclusion in the dialogue of the Republic because he points out, well, an actual philosopher genuinely brilliant, genius, theoretical mind who wants to question the highest things in the universe and learn the truth isn't interested in figuring out how the pothole on the street outside is going to get fixed, right? But to be the ruler, to be in politics, you got to figure out how's the pothole going to get fixed in the street. And so there are all kinds of intrinsic problems there. There's also there's a bigger practical problem, and this gets missed. You think of all the discussions we've been having over the recent months with COVID and government-ordered lockdowns and all these safety precautions. A scientist, as a scientist, can present to you data about a specific topic that they've been studying. That's it. A scientist has nothing to say over what your priorities are or ought to be. I mean, that's not. No scientist can. Only you can decide that. Only I can decide what's important to me, what's valuable to me, so on and so forth. So if we were to go to scientists and say, scientists, we want to get our risk of catching contagious diseases as close to zero as possible. How should we live? So we don't want any risk at all. The answer would be something like, well, since we're talking about movies and TVs, you remember the movie The Matrix with Keanu Reeves and where they're actually living? They're living in these pods, right? Every human being has its own little pod, and they're being fed, with nourishment intravenously and all this kind of stuff. And they have cables plugged into their brains, which make them think that they're out in some world doing things, but they're really just motionless in this little pod.
I thought you were going to reference the Bubble Boy from Seinfeld, but I mean that is another way.
The Moors, no, the Moops. That would work too. And the point is, scientists could certainly design some way of living that would reduce our risk of contagious diseases to near zero. And who would want to live like that? And the answer is no. Well, maybe some would. I don't know. I don't think most people would want to live with that. Most people would say there are goods that I value more than perfect health. If seeing my, spouse, parents, children, friends, loved ones, if that means accepting some risk into my life that I might get sick, I might catch something, many people would say, yeah, I'll take that risk. And there's a whole spectrum, right? Some people say, I know it's dangerous to jump out of an airplane and skydive, but I value the thrill of that experience, right? More, it's worth the risk to me as an individual. Most people say, yeah, it's not worth the risk. That's too risky. I don't want to jump out of an airplane. But the point is, there's this whole spectrum, and governing ourselves, to govern, whether you're governing yourself or you're selected to govern others, it means weighing all these things. What are all these options? What are the pros? What are the cons? What are the costs? What are the benefits? You don't get that from the scientists. What you get from the scientists is, here's the data.
Right.
Here's the data.
Here's the data, and there's no thought to unintended consequences.
That's right.
There's no thought to that. At the same time, there's also no thought to who gets to participate and who doesn't. And I think this is often overlooked when I've heard people.
You mean participate in the decision making?
No, both. I mean, there's that question, right? Which are the experts that actually get a vote? Which are the experts who's the right expert and who's the wrong expert? Because experts, like in The Simpsons, never actually all agree. There's never 100% agreement. But even more so, let's say as a society, we all did decide we want the Matrix. We want a system where we are all living in this virtual world. There was another movie more recently, something like that. But we all want to live in this virtual world. We want food fed to us intravenously. We want all of these machines hooked up to us that'll keep us alive forever, right? There's no end until we decide, okay, I'm done. I don't want to live in this virtual world anymore. It's been fun, but I'm bored now. Because eventually you're going to learn everything there is to learn. You're gonna know how to do everything. It's just going to kind of become boring. But even in those circumstances, there's got to be scientists who stay back and help make sure that everybody's taken care of.
Yeah. Run the machines, grease the wheels.
How do those scientists feel if they're the ones who are chosen not to? And then what happens when they die? Do you wake somebody up?
Right.
Do you pull somebody out and say, okay, you had your fun, now it's your turn.
Yep.
And now you have to do it until somebody else dies. Eventually, that doesn't work.
Right.
The scientists can't just have kids and assume that those kids are going to be capable. And could you imagine that life? If you're born as a child who is told you were only created for the purpose of becoming a scientist to maintain this.
In good progressive style, you could just have yourself a tyranny and control what everybody's going to do. And then, the world of science fiction literature explores those kinds of themes. What happens when you have, precisely because of these kinds of problems you're raising, one solution, possible solution, is to say we're going to control who gets born and how they're educated and what we're going to control all this. Yeah.
Right. You're going to have children born who are, let's say, dentists. Mm-hmm. who are their only job is to become dentists and make sure that everybody in their pods, that their teeth stay okay so they don't get a viral infection in their mouth that leads to their death. It's like the movie The Minority Report.
Can you imagine getting a root canal in a pod? That would suck.
Maybe that's thunder. Maybe that's thunder and lightning. It's a hurricane. All you end up doing is creating another civilization. Right. You have to keep growing civilization to fulfill certain things. So one of two things either has to happen. Either you start waking people up and you take away their right to live in that world. Mm-hmm. If we're saying, okay, most of humanity is going to live in that world, but we're going to take away the right from some so that they can provide a service, or we're going to have citizens born into a role, it's for slavery.
Here, I think the point you're making can be summed up this way. Central planning always requires some form of tribalism. Always. It has to. Because you can't have everyone living in one way, right? You need others who are going to provide the service, the engineering, whatever it requires for others to live the way that they want to live.
I'm going to take it a step further. It's not just it does require a sense of tribalism. It also requires slavery.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It also requires some people to be subservient to somebody else who is making a decision. And as soon as that happens, you have injustice.
You're exactly right. It's one of the great dangers. A number of thoughtful writers, thinkers have thought this whole problem through. Once you say our focus, or the only good that matters is the collective good, the good of the many. Once you cross that line, says that's what we care about, the collective good, it becomes really easy. It becomes a short step to start violating the rights of certain individuals, treating them as slaves. They become cogs in a machine whose purpose is to serve the collective good. Right. And I think you're right about that. It's sort of inescapable, and there's only one alternative to the idea of focusing on the collective good, which is what progressivism does. That's its whole premise. The alternative is to say we're going to focus on the individual good.
Right.
We're going to create a system of government here that has one and only one purpose: to make sure that each individual is secure in that person's freedom, property, natural liberty to govern themselves. And then whatever they make of their lives, whatever the collective becomes, is up to all those free individuals. They can make it what they want to make it.
So then let's juxtapose those two scenarios and in the one other thing that forms out of one and not the other. If everybody lived in these pods that you're talking about, like the Matrix, and you have scientists and you have people being born and trained just to do specific jobs, is there any innovation? Is that experience for the people in the pods ever going to improve?
Right.
Is there ever going to be an improvement in the life that you get to live even virtually inside your mind? Whereas when we're all here and we're all free and we're all safe within our person and property, we get to innovate.
Right. Innovation never stops.
We continue to get to try to figure out how do we make life better.
Right.
And you've talked about this for years. When you look at the founding of the United States, that curve skyrockets.
Yep, absolutely.
And I think it's worth
and it's not just
understanding that.
It's not just in the United States. It's around the globe.
Right. But it started in the United States is my point.
Yeah.
When that idea of individual freedom and personal rights and a guarantee of your own property.
Yeah, property rights is a big deal.
Right.
Once laws started to protect property rights, even nominally, meaning not even perfect property right protection, but just somewhat. It's amazing how creative and when people realize, wow, if I produce something, if I create something, if I invent something, I get to keep it. Or even what's more likely, if I invent something and sell it to lots of people and they pay me money or they trade things with me, I get to keep all of that. It's amazing how that incentivizes creativity and entrepreneurial inventiveness.
Right.
And all connected to what we're talking about here. Part of the emphasis, the progressive view that we should just defer to the experts, listen to the experts, obey the experts. I mean, perhaps if there was one word that, in my mind, best captures life under progressivism, it is comply or compliance. Comply. Somebody's going to tell you what to do and when to do it and how to do it and why to do it, what motivations you're allowed to have and what motivations you may not have, and your job is to comply. It makes impossible one of the highest human virtues, which is prudence. Prudence is the classical word prudentio. It means it's not just being smart. It's having practical wisdom. Mm-hmm. It does require some smarts. It requires knowing some things about the world and about human beings and where you are and what's going on, and then thinking through all the particulars in your situation to solve a problem, to figure out what is the right thing to do right here, right now in this challenging situation. Aristotle, for example, places prudence in some cases as among the crown jewels of human virtue because it requires all the other virtues.
Right.
It requires courage, for example. If you're terrified and shaking in fear, you're not going to make a very prudential choice, right?
Sure.
It requires some prudence. It requires some intelligence. It requires some justice. You have to be willing to act justly to other people to make a wise, prudent decision. And progressivism takes away prudence from the individual. It says you don't need to be prudent. We're going to decide how you're going to run your business, how you're going to educate your children, what medicines you will take if you have these illnesses. And to a large degree, it takes away prudence even from the elected representatives in government. This sort of circles back to what I was talking about before. Congress today in our very progressive world, it's not a deliberative body. Its main job is to, is number one, to fund, make sure that they're keeping tax levels high enough to fund all these agencies. You know what happens in the offices of most members of Congress? You know who are the busiest people? A typical, say, a member of the House of Representatives. That representative will have 2 or 3 people who work full-time in the role of constituent services. Right. And what that means in practice is constituents, someone within their congressional district, has a problem with some government agency. Maybe grandma's not getting her Social Security check on time, or it's being mailed to the wrong address or something, or a business owner has certain problems with OSHA or the EPA or whatever it happens to be, and they pick up the phone and they call their representative, and there's a staff there to help the voter navigate through all the government regulations and agencies and this and that. And what's sad is that large numbers of citizens today, when they get that help, rather than being disgusted they're thankful.
Right.
and they go vote for that representative again because that representative helped them deal with get some form signed by some, regulatory agency in order to expand their business parking lot or whatever it is, rather than thinking, this is outrageous. Why in the world do I have to go navigate all these bureaucratic hurdles just to, make my parking lot bigger?
Right. Or to use my property in a certain way. We've talked in the past about the restaurant we like to have lunch at.
Right.
That just wanted to use part of their parking lot as a patio.
Right.
And for years tried to get the government to give them the permit to do it.
That's right.
And it wasn't until COVID that all of a sudden, not only did the government say, sure, you can do that. No, now you have to do that.
Right.
We've wanted to do this for years, and you've said this is not okay. The government has said, no, you can't do this. Oh, but now with COVID, you have to.
You have to.
So I want to go back to the prudence thing, too, because the prudence thing, I think part of the issue is prudence takes a lot of effort. It takes being thoughtful. It takes thinking through things, working through things, understanding them.
Let me add one other thing. I mentioned courage before in the sense of you can't be shaking in fear, but also courage. Prudence requires courage because if you're going to make a decision using your prudence, there's always the chance your decision won't be the right one.
Right.
That can be a scary thing, right? So you've got to have the courage to say, I'm going to try, I'm going to do my best to think through and make what I think is the right decision here. Business owners do this all the time.
Every day.
They make a decision and there's no guarantee that it's the right decision. It might end up being the wrong decision. And so to be a self-governing, choosing, prudential person requires a lot of courage.
I mean, think about that real quick. The business owners who do that. Think about the companies. I mean, we have this love in America of bashing pharmaceutical companies, right? Big pharma is these bad people who are making money off of people's illnesses.
Right.
Think about the number of pharmaceutical companies who invested not thousands, not millions, but billions of dollars into research and development, trying to find a cure to a disease or something in that sector.
And they failed.
And it's all lost.
Yep.
And it's gone.
They built laboratories. They hired scientists, right? All this capital investment. And they were hoping to be able to sell something at some point, right? To get a return, and they failed.
And some of these scientists got paid very well, right? So the owners of this pharmaceutical company spent billions of dollars, and the doctors got wealthy off of it.
Right.
And they have nothing to show for it, and they have no returns to make on it. That takes courage.
Absolutely.
To go out and say, I am going to try to cure this disease. And then people say, well, so the doctors got rich, and that's not fair. Well, but the doctors go out and they spend that money with other people, and they buy things that somebody had to assemble. And that's when people say to me things like trickle-down economics don't work. My head wants to explode. Like, think about that. A business person lost all of their livelihood.
Right.
Somebody had the courage to go start a business and failed.
Right.
Lost their entire livelihood. And think about all the other people. How that money got distributed out throughout.
In fact, let's be real clear here. Many, first of all, the vast majority of startup businesses fail within 18 months or so. I'm talking about 85% of them. I mean, the overwhelming majority fail. And the vast majority of those are small businesses. They're people trying to go start a restaurant, go open a store, something, small businesses. And many of those people, the way they capitalize their startup, they charge up their credit cards, they'll take out a second mortgage on their home. And what that means is when their business fails, they're in a bad shape. They're in a really, really bad pickle in their own life. It's not like they just say, well, that failed, I'll go back to my life as it was. No, how are you going to make your house payment? How are you going to feed yourself? So it's absolutely true. Tremendous risk is involved in going out there into the entrepreneurial realm to act like an entrepreneur. So
if success requires prudence and courage, can Joe Biden be a successful president? The guy who refuses to have the courage to answer a single question. The guy who just says, I'm just going to rely on what people tell me to do.
Right.
And I don't know if those people are thinking about what these people are thinking about. And these experts are talking about something different than these experts.
Right.
You have a guy who is refusing to make any decision for himself.
Right.
He's listening to other politicians. He's listening to other so-called experts, the experts who he agrees with rather than the experts who would challenge his thoughts. Can he be successful?
Not as a self-governing person and not as a self-governing citizen. He can be successful as a ward of the progressive state. He can be successful from a progressive definition, because from a progressive definition, it means defer to the experts.
But isn't that a short-term success? Can that ever
Sure.
be a long-term success?
Well, in the same way, when the investors go and hire a bunch of scientists, right, and build a laboratory and fail to invent what they want to invent, there are always some winners, right? So the scientists who just got paid lots of money for 5 or 10 years to go do research, they won in that. And so same thing from the progressive point of view. There are millions of unelected bureaucrats who are going to benefit in the short term from, someone like Joe Biden being president. Absolutely.
I go back to something like when LBJ created Social Security, right? Social Security was FDR.
Social Security Act of 1935.
Okay.
Yeah.
LBJ made a speech.
LBJ gave us the war on poverty.
Right. But he expanded Social Security, correct?
Yeah.
Significantly. Because I'm thinking about a speech he made in the 60s where he got up in front of his supporters and at a rally and he says, today we now have 20 million seniors covered by Social Security.
Right.
He didn't say anything about quality.
Right.
He didn't say those 20 million are going to be able to get paid and the next generation is going to get their Social Security in the next generation.
Right.
And now you and I and the following generations are all looking at a Social Security program that's bankrupt. People have been paying into it for years.
Right.
And it's paying less and less and less. And the cost of living in the progressive era, the capital P, capital E progressive era, has gone up and up and up exponentially.
Right.
Social Security doesn't really do anything for anybody, and it won't if we continue down this path.
You have to go all the way back. I mean, we saw this in the Obama administration. There were moments where President Obama he actually thought it was a bragging point. He thought this was something to be congratulated on, that the numbers of people on various kinds of assistance programs were increasing. He touted that as a great success of his administration, right? When you stand back and think about it, don't we want the numbers of people on receiving government assistance to go down?
Right.
We don't want it to actually go up. But this is what progressivism does. It turns everything upside down. From the progressive point of view, the freest people are the most controlled, regulated, censored, supervised people. It almost becomes this Orwellian thing. You and I have mentioned this before. Those early progressives, many of them, they tended to be intellectual types, academic types in the universities. In fact, many of them helped create the new PhD programs in the 1870s, 1880s, that whole period there in the social sciences. So sociology, political science, history, those kinds of disciplines. And many of them, because there was no PhD available in the United States prior to the Civil War, they went to Germany. The Germans were the ones who created this degree and created the graduate programs around it. And they came back, and what they were studying, those social sciences, those were the same, that was the social science that eventually fuels National Socialism, which is the formal, polite name for Nazism.
Right.
I mean, it's the same body of thought. We're going to have a centrally planned society. We're going to have bureaucrats certainly controlling the economy and everything connected to the economy. But when you really think that through, what's connected to the economy, the answer is Well, almost everything is connected. Your daily life schedules affects the economy.
Just go look at the Supreme Court rulings on the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Yeah.
I mean, right?
Yeah.
They have managed to take the Interstate Commerce Clause and apply it to
Everything. Everything. Yeah. This is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The Constitution authorizes Congress. So this is a grant of power to Congress. That's really important because it's going to be used to justify all these other agencies that are not Congress. But it says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the several states. That's the actual interstate commerce, commercial activity, which includes, right, some kind of productivity and some kind of exchange. To engage in commerce means to trade somehow.
Right.
So it has to be trading, and it's among the several states. So it's got to cross at least one state line. What they do is they say, well, we're going to extend it to include non-commercial activity within a state. And they went even farther. They say, commerce is kind of a synonym for the economy. They kind of mean the same thing. So what Congress really is authorized to regulate it is the economy. And if they can regulate the economy, then they can regulate things that affect the economy. In fact, they come up with one of their fancy constitutional tests. Any activity that has a substantial effect on the economy.
Define substantial.
Exactly, right? And you see how this is just opening a Pandora's box. And so you get ridiculous Supreme Court cases where, some old farmer in Ohio grows a little extra wheat so that he and his wife and kids can eat it. They make some pancakes and bread, right? And he gets fined. He gets fined by the United States government, and they say, hey, we told you may not grow that. We prohibited you. And he says, but this is just me growing wheat, and I'm eating the wheat right here. Doesn't matter, because when you grow your own wheat, then you don't go buy bread from the grocery store, which means the grocery stores stock less bread, which means transport trucks filled with food bring less bread to the grocery store. That has an effect on the economy. Ergo, Congress has the power to tell you how much wheat you may and may not grow. And if you grant that premise, it means Congress has the power to regulate every human activity. Because the truth is, whether you, Dave, get enough sleep or not is going to affect what you do the next day, how productive you are or are not, and multiply you by millions. That affects the economy. So arguably, Congress has the power to regulate how much sleep you get, how much you exercise, what food you eat, everything.
Well, and then you get this other side of the coin of Congress has the ability to control all of those things, but let's not be judgmental. If somebody's unhealthy, that's their choice, right? So it just leads you in this like juxtaposition of that would lead a robot's head to explode.
It's absolutely true.
It's incalculable.
And and we've been talking about some of the more almost I want to say comical. I mean, real people really get hurt and their businesses are destroyed. So it's actually not funny. But there's also a very ugly underside to this whole notion of progressive central planning, what progressivism is. I think many Americans today forget one of the most not just popular, but respected and respectable parts of the early progressive movement was the science of eugenics. These are scientists sitting around scratching their chin. I mean, going back to the model of everyone living in a pod, they're deciding who do we think is fit to reproduce and who is not. And we in the government, we unelected bureaucrats, we're going to decide which classes of people are going to be forcibly sterilized so that they cannot reproduce. Right. And this is all part of the progressive dream of creating a better future. We'll find what did Hillary Clinton call her opponents? Deplorables. We'll figure out who the deplorables are and stop them from reproducing so that the future will be a future filled with progressives,
right?
Right, and get rid of all that. That's the world of progressivism, and it's an ugly thing. I think, remember Nancy Reagan had that campaign about drugs.
Just say no to drugs.
Just say no to drugs. It's time that we just say no to progressivism.
Well, and I think that's an important message right now of all time, right? We have a major decision to make.
Right.
As Ronald Reagan said in 1964, it's a time for choosing.
Yeah.
And what do you want? Do you want progressivism or do you want the American idea? And at the Vino Veritas Society, we exist because we want the American idea and we want others to understand why that is so important and what the threat that progressivism chooses. I strongly believe in that argument that Joe Biden cannot be successful. He can be a successful steward of progressivism, but in the long run, it's going to fail. It can't survive. It has too many contradictions. It has too many times where, okay, this group, we killed off this group and we still have a problem. So now let's kill off another group and we still have a problem, and let's kill off another group, or let's pull them out of the pods, or whatever, however you want to describe it. And at one point, you're hurting your children. At one point, you're hurting their children, or their children, or their children, or their children, and maybe all of the above. And we just have to get to a point where it's time to just say no. This is not going to be what America turns into.
If we are successful, we were talking about success. If we are successful at the Vino and Veritas Society, we will be looking at a future United States where progressivism isn't even on the table. That's not of interest to the American people. What is of interest, where the debates are, where the disputes are, is in what ways can we best protect the American idea? In what ways can we best protect the individual liberty and private property of citizens, right? And there are meaningful discussions, and reasonable people can disagree on those kinds of things. That's where we want to move the conversations, the challenges, the disputes over there revolving around the American idea of liberty, not this disastrous progressive notion of central planning.
And to leave it on a high note, not only will we be having those debates, but the celebrations will be markedly different as well.
Yeah.
The celebrations will not be, look at all the people who are now covered by bad insurance.
Right.
So yes, they have health insurance now because of Obamacare, but their deductibles are $10,000, $12,000 for a family, and the coverage is awful, and they can't get this class of drugs or whatever else it is.
Right.
The celebration will be, look what that company, look at the innovation. Right. We just cured cancer. We just cured diseases that COVID's gone like that. You know, the next COVID, the next coronavirus. We celebrate the things that people can achieve when they're free and secure to do so.
Yep. Innovation and inventiveness is a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. And that's why we will continue to guard the American idea.
No sumos custodes.
No sumos custodes. Until next time.